and I'm here with three colleagues. My three colleagues are also my good friends, and as you know, we host these town halls about once a month, and I have Mitzi Hunter with me, the MPP for Scarborough Guildwood, and I have Paul Ainsley with me, the councillor for Scarborough Guildwood, the slim Paul Ainsley, who is out walking 90 minutes every morning. A testimony to hard work. But I'm going to let the lovely and charming Mitzi Hunter introduce herself first, then I'll go to Paul, and then I'll introduce my friend Bill Blair.
Thanks, John, and hello, everyone. It's really great for me to join your MP, John McKay, and City Councillor Paul Ainsley as your MPP for Scarborough Guildwood to do these town halls. It's an opportunity for us to talk about topics that are very important to the community. For the majority of the times we've gathered like this virtually, we've been talking about COVID-19 and about health issues. But I think tonight's topic is equally as timely and relevant to all of you. So I'm very thrilled to see so many people join this call and those who will be joining after as part of the sharing that we will be doing on all of our social media. So I'm hoping that everyone is doing well, staying safe and healthy, and that you'll have a really good conversation tonight. So thank you so much.
Paul?
Thank you, John. Good evening, everybody. It's great to be joined by my my federal and provincial colleagues, John McKay and Mitzi Hunter, and Minister Blair. Looking forward to a great evening with you. We always have very comprehensive and stimulating conversations. It's great to see so many of our residents are online, and I'm sure they're looking forward to this evening's discussion. Welcome, Minister Blair.
Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Mitzi, and I'm happy to welcome my colleague and friend Bill Blair to our town hall. When we first planned this, we were talking back in November that we really should have someone talk about emergency preparedness and security issues, and then it got postponed, I think, once. But here we are. 2 months later, we've had a blockade of Ottawa and a whole bunch of border crossings across the country, in which our guest has been intimately involved. And this last evening, President Putin launched an all-out war on Ukraine. And so our timing is precipitous and more than mildly depressing, because Bill's portfolio is emergency preparedness, and little could he have anticipated when the Prime Minister asked him to do it that it would include fires, and it would include floods, and it would include viruses, and it would include blockades in the country. But fortunately, Bill's got a lot of experience going for him. The most significant, of course, is that he was the former chief of police of the city of Toronto, which I'm sure gave him a bit of an edge on his current portfolio. But in addition, he's from Scarborough. So if you're from Scarborough, you can handle anything. As we all know, Scarborough is the center of the universe, and so I'm very pleased to welcome Bill to the town hall. And before we launch into the first question, I'll just ask Bill to make a few remarks.
Yeah, I'll be unusually brief, John. I just wanted
That'll be a
to say,
novel.
yeah, no kidding. I just wanted to say how pleased I was when you invited me, and to be able to attend a conversation with the people of Scarborough Guildwood. For over 25 years, I was a resident of your riding. Paul was my city councillor. Hi, Paul. John was my MP, and Mitzi has been for a number of years a great friend and an incredible asset and supporter of mine in the service to my community in Scarborough Southwest. I've learned so much from Mitzi. So the opportunity to be with the three of you and to be back in this community is one I am grateful for, and I look forward to everyone's questions.
It's great. It's great. Well, we don't lack for questions. I have to say that having been doing this for what are we're probably approaching a couple of years now doing this. I
Sadly,
have never,
yes.
yes,
Mm.
I have never seen such a huge number of questions, and so we're not going to be able to address them all. But of course, top of mind is the blockade in Ottawa and the blockades at the border crossings. And so the questioner has asked. This is the question was submitted. As the former chief of Toronto Police, what is your perspective on how the city of Ottawa could have prevented or mitigated the impact of the truck convoy and the residents in the parliamentary precinct? So we're obviously keenly interested in your thoughts on that, Bill.
Yeah, a couple of things, John. First of all, in this country, our Charter of Rights and Freedoms is the highest law of the land, and it allows for freedom of opinion, expression, and assembly, lawful, peaceful protest. And as the chief of police in Toronto, and Paul will certainly know this because we do deal with a great number of protests that take place every single day in the city of Toronto. Some of them are loud and sometimes they're even kind of challenging. But what we saw in Ottawa was fundamentally different, and that people didn't just merely come to protest, but they came to stay. They came to occupy the space, and the impact that they were having on the people of Ottawa was incredibly harmful. The disruption to their lives, and it wasn't just the noise, but it was threats and intimidation. There was a feeling of unease and unsafety in that community. Businesses shut down. People wouldn't send their kids to school. It was a really, really difficult situation. Let me acknowledge, I was quite frankly a little bit surprised in the way the police responded to that because I'm from Toronto, and the police do facilitate lawful, peaceful protest, but they place reasonable limits on that when it starts to interfere with the activities of others. And we saw a similar convoy come into Toronto. It was heading for Queen's Park, and I thought it was managed quite thoughtfully and appropriately using the existing legal tools. But what had happened in Ottawa when those trucks came in and parked, and a couple of things happened very quickly. As I said, it was incredibly disruptive for the people of Ottawa. Secondly, the tow truck companies that would normally be used to come and tag and tow those cars out of there, and particularly the big trucks, all said that they were receiving threats and intimidation, and they wouldn't come into the area, which rendered it very difficult for the police. And so that situation was persisting, and I think what we saw is the police were not able, for a number of different reasons, to use the tools that were available to them municipally or provincially or federally. And what I tried to do initially was I convened what we call a trilateral table. So I contacted the mayor, I contacted the provincial solicitor general, and I said, come on, all three orders of government have a responsibility to the people of Ottawa. Let's come to the table. And I'm going to tell you, it was a little bit tough to convene that table. The city of Ottawa was desperate, as you can imagine, to have help. But the province was very reluctant to come and engage in that conversation, and that was a bit of a challenge. And then something else happened that I thought was elevated it beyond just simply a very serious problem to an emergency. And that was when the blockades then went to essential trade corridors, our ports of entry, and started blockading the bridge at the Ambassador Bridge, for example, in Coutts, Alberta, Emerson, Manitoba, out at the Pacific Highway in British Columbia. And just for example, when they shut down the bridge at Windsor, and it was shut down for several days, that was costing the economy of Ontario over $350 million a day. It was also cut off the supply of parts that come to and from our factories, and all of the auto plants in Ontario had to shut their lines down. Thousands and thousands of Ontario workers were idled by this. And as well, it started to impact the flow of goods and services, food for our grocery shelves. And so in my mind, it really elevated it to an emergency. And that's why we made the difficult decision. And I'm primarily responsible for the Emergency Act in our government. but it was an incredibly difficult decision to use that authority for the very first time. And we tried to do it in after a great deal of consultation with law enforcement and with city officials and others. We tried to do it in a really measured and proportional way. I wanted that resolved safely, and I wanted it resolved with a minimum amount of force, and within, to the extent possible, the legal limitations, and it always had to be charter compliant. As I said, that's the highest law of the land, and it worked. You know, quite frankly, I think if we measure the success of a decision, it is by its outcome, and I think the outcome was appropriate. Those blockades were removed. The people of Ottawa got their city back. The threat at our ports of entry has significantly reduced, and I've been assured by the police that they got it from here. That the situation has been rendered sufficiently under control and safe that they can go back to using the existing authorities. And so, while it was important to very carefully consider using the Emergency Act, it was also important to recognize that as soon as the emergency passed, we had to drop and revoke those measures and get us back to normal as quickly as possible. So that in a nutshell is what it's done. I think and by the way, there's really strong parliamentary oversight in the use of our emergency measures, but a very thorough review of all the circumstances that led to the calling of an emergency, which will look at, you know, whether or not policing was effective and how things might be done differently in the future.
Thank you, Bill, for that comprehensive answer. I'm a little mindful of the time, and Paul, I'm going to pass it on to you for your first question from whomever the citizen might be.
Okay, thank you, John. Minister, this question is from Craig. He would like to know, how is your government working to bolster national resilience and readiness for future pandemics and other emergencies through enhancing the management of strategic stockpiles and through coordination with other governments, in particular the province of Ontario and the city of Toronto?
Yeah, it's a great question, and I think it's fair to say that, you know, when the pandemic hit, there was some preparatory work done, but we very quickly learned we didn't have the personal protection equipment, we didn't have sufficient respirators. It was a bit of a scramble at the front end, and we've learned lessons from that. I'm actually responsible in my new portfolio for ensuring that the government of Canada is much better prepared for any future emergency, including a health emergency like a pandemic. And so the government of Canada is already working, and we don't do it alone. We work with our provincial partners and with the private sector as well to ensure that there are adequate stockpiles of those things which are needed in such an emergency. And there's a wide range of things from vaccines and therapeutics, but also to hospital equipment, for personal protection equipment. We were, you know, I think we worked very hard. Actually, we worked around the clock, Paul, to try to catch up and get that equipment into the country. But we've learned the need for better preparation. I will tell you, it was a big motivator when the Prime Minister called me in and said he was going to create a new federal department that he asked me to head up as the Minister for Emergency Preparedness, to make sure that Canada is far better prepared and more resilient. And it's to an all hazards approach. So whether we're talking floods and fires, earthquakes and tsunamis, biological threats such as the pandemic, even cyber attacks. And so we're looking at making sure Canada is far better prepared. And I'm now creating a department within the government that will have that responsibility, and included in that is a responsibility to maintain better situational awareness, to keep our eyes and ears open right around the world so that we can see these things coming and be better able to react.
Thank you.
Okay. Why don't we move to Mitzi and then we'll circle back. So Mitzi, what's your question?
Okay, so great to see you, Bill. And I'm not going to let you off the hook that easily, because you did say that everything was turned back over to local police, which I think is good. Canadians want to see that. But I still see a heavy police presence as I'm trying to get to the Queen's Park precinct in Toronto and along University Avenue. And I know that the people of Ottawa are still seeing a heavy police presence. So at what point will this be phased out, or how long will it take before things get back to normal?
Yeah, and it's an important question, and I really like getting things back to normal, Mitzi. And I'll talk about that a little bit more in a second. But when I say the emergency has come to an end, unfortunately, the threat has not. The threat still exists. There are, unfortunately, there are people in convoys that are still out there. They're staged outside of our cities. They've indicated a willingness to try to go back in and engage in very disruptive and potentially dangerous behavior. It's the same at the borders. And so the police are vigilant now, but they've assured us they have the tools that they can manage it. It's different. It's very important, I think, that we distinguish in our own minds a threat, and there's a very real threat environment that exists here that the police now have a responsibility to deal with. And when that exceeds the capacity of the police to manage, then it becomes an emergency. And I think that's what happened to us 10 days ago. But having managed through that emergency, my point is that it's important for it to go back into the existing legal framework for dealing with these things and the appropriate tools for the police and the police for. I said right at the beginning of this, Canadians really need the police to do their job, and they need to do it right. And so, we've seen in some cities they've done it exceptionally well. In Ottawa, they struggled a little bit, but they're in much better place now. But can I also tell you, Mitzi, the other day I was in Ottawa and I went out with Yasser Nakvi, who I know you know well, and what we saw, the blockades were gone, the trucks were gone, but the people hadn't come back. The traffic wasn't flowing down the streets. People weren't walking on the streets. And so we went for a walk and we went to a restaurant and I went in, the guy, a really nice guy, great food, by the way, but there was nobody there. And the city hadn't come back. And I think we have to be very mindful. It's not just dealing with the protesters, but it's dealing with people. I will tell you as a police chief, the thing that keeps our safe is talking to each other, go to local businesses, cars driving safely up and down our streets. That's the lifeblood of a city. And when that's cut off because of fear or intimidation, or even sometimes the barricades of the police, I think we all have an obligation to get us back to normal as fast as we can.
Thanks, Mitzi. And I would just reiterate Bill's experience of downtown Ottawa. It is a bit of a ghost town. It was a bit of a ghost town. The other kind of bizarre experience I had was that in 24 years of going to Ottawa, the first time I've ever had to have a police escort in order to be able to get into the building. So it was a very much different environment and not what we expect Canada to be. Bill, I wanted to move to a bit of a question that expands on your portfolio, and it's pretty obvious that the Prime Minister seemed to think that that setting up your portfolio as a separate department was pretty important. So the questioner asks, we've seen an increasing number of emergency situations, whether due to climate change or recently from the convoy. Is Canada's emergency planning and infrastructure sufficient to deal with these challenges? And so the question is asking you to expand on what your view is with respect to our emergency planning.
Well, first of all, emergency planning, management, and response it's a shared responsibility. The city takes on a great deal of that responsibility. So does the province, and the federal government also has a fairly significant role. I think generally, and I'll harken back to our response to the floods that took place in British Columbia. That was a pretty significant event. It seems like a lifetime ago, but it was only a few months, and it was hugely impactful. Like over 8,000 people's homes were washed away, and we're still dealing with issues of interim housing. I think the response from everyone, all three orders of government. I was out to see the mayor in Abbotsford. The province stepped up. We stepped up. The response was impressive, but it could be better. And I think that's the whole point of having better planning, better integration and communications between us. Is also really important. And can I just share one thing that I've really been thinking about as a result of the work that we did in British Columbia after the floods? We've got to actually incorporate First Nations and Indigenous people into that response and that planning and preparation. And that's the role the Prime Minister has asked me to take on, working with the municipalities, First Nations, and the provinces to build, a greater resiliency. And I can also tell you, it's really expensive for the Government of Canada. We have a thing called the Disaster Financial Assistance Arrangement that I oversee, and it's several $billion each year, where we go in and help people rebuild who've been burnt out as a result of forest fires and the urban interface or massive flooding, but it's a really expensive thing. We want to make sure that instead of just building back the way it's always been, where it's always been, the climate change is clearly impacting on some of these things. And so we're looking at finding ways to invest that money, not just in a rebuild, but also in adaptation and mitigation measures, so that we can build a more resilient Canada and be less vulnerable to these things. I think it's in the long run, it's actually a far more efficient way to spend money. I was told today that $1 spent on prevention of flood damage is worth $11 of recovery. And so it's just a smart investment. And so that's one of my jobs that the Prime Minister has given me is to try to turn the way in which all orders of government look at emergency and disaster, and start doing the work that is necessary to mitigate its impact and do a better job of protecting Canadians. And when disaster does strike, make sure that we've got all our ducks lined up and that we're working really well together so that we can respond quickly and appropriately and help people out.
Okay. I'd like to do a follow-up question on the insurance industry, but I'm going to pass it on to Paul. Paul, what have you got?
Okay. Thanks, John. Bill, I have a very similar question. Wendy is asking, what specific actions is your government committed to in order to implement combating climate change with sustainable, habitable housing development, which is affordable and not relative to the regional market value in a property inflated by developers?
Paul, that's the biggest and most that's a difficult but a huge question that's been asked, because the work that we're doing in climate change mitigation is really important. We've put a price on carbon. We're investing in a new green technology. There's just a massive undertaking. I will tell you that the existential threat of climate change, it threads through everything our government's doing, every discussion we have, because it is a reality and we've got a responsibility to address it. We also know that there's lots of Canadians that are involved in the energy sector, and we've got to help them through a robust transition into a greener economy and greener energy sources. You raise the issue of housing affordability, and I think, and I even in my own writing, and I only live next door, is people are very concerned about the affordability of housing, and it's not just we see that those who are well established and own a home, they see their equity rising quite significantly, but they're all worried their kids aren't going to be able to afford a house. I had conversations with 2 of my 3 children today, all in the housing market, all looking to buy a house, and all really concerned with the cost and affordability of housing, rising interest rates. And so those are things that are very much front of mind for us. And finally, and I think this is really relevant to Scarborough, we recognize that, for a long time, governments kind of get out of the business of affordable housing. And yet we've got to do a much better job of building housing. The whole housing affordability issue is really a product of both supply and demand. We know the demand is strong, and so we've got to have programs and support all 3 orders of government to get more affordable housing built. And Scarborough's a perfect example of that. It's a great place to live, and so we have to make sure that we utilize all of our authorities appropriately and together to make sure that it's an affordable place to live for people who want to live in Scarborough. And so it's a great question. I think we could spend hours on it, and then John will be mad at me because my answer is too long. But so
That's true. That's true.
Thanks,
It'll be just like the good old days before the Public Safety Committee. I had to cut off Bill on a fairly regular basis so that other members could ask questions. The other member to ask a question is Mitzi Hunter.
Thank you. So I know, Bill, you will understand this more than most. Shootings in Scarborough are up 43% year to date. I actually have been working on this issue for quite some time, as you know, because I've talked to you about it. How do we reduce and end gun violence in our communities? My private member's bill is about making it a public health crisis, because I believe that we have to get to the healing of trauma that affects communities, making sure they have the help and support that they need, reduce things like retaliation and the cycle of violence. And, but we have had some real devastating tragedies. There was a grade 12 student killed in a high school, David and Mary Thompson, just last week. So I'm asking this question on behalf of Pat and Cam Sanborn, and they ask, when will the handgun buyback programs be implemented? And when will increased surveillance be implemented at our border crossings?
Okay. A couple of things to unpack in that. I think it is the most important question. And Mitzi, as you know, I spent 40 years of my life trying to keep people safe in the city of Toronto. I became the police chief in what was the year of the gun in 2005, and we implemented a lot of programs that follow very much the thinking that you're talking about of putting, like I put almost 500 additional police officers in uniform out in the neighborhoods, and I told them, I don't want you to go out there and arrest everybody. I want you to go out there and help everybody feel safe and be safe. I put police officers in schools, and I not to enforce the law and not to and be the hall monitor. I wanted them to build relationships with young people so that they could be safe in their own communities. Jordan Manners, when he died as a result of a gunshot in North York at C.W. Jeffries, huge moment for the city as well, and brought about, I think, really significant change. And we know that there are some things we can do, but you don't arrest your way out of these things. And I know that's a trite thing to say, but I've said it 1,000 times, and it's really true. I think we've got to sometimes, we often think about, like, let's lock up the bad guys. And don't get me wrong, there are some people who are just so dangerous that society needs to be protected from them, and that the police and the court should deal with them. But there's something else going on. And I was in a neighborhood a few years ago. It was actually in North York, but there'd been over 20 shootings that summer, and every child in that neighborhood knew somebody who'd been the victim of a gunshot. You think about the generational trauma that comes from that. And when those kids growing up, first of all, their pride in their own neighborhood, their aspirations for themselves are all affected by that. And so I agree with you completely. I actually went to the government, John will know this, and because they were talking about, gun control measures, and gun control measures are really important. I'm a strong advocate of gun control. But it's not just about investing in the police. It's not just about investing in investigations. And we've done that. We put a lot of money actually into helping the police do gun and gang investigations. But it's just as important to invest in community. It's just as important to invest in those kids. Give those kids better choices, better supports. Deal with you talked about a public health approach. I agree with you 100%. If you look at the social determinants of health, they're also the social determinants of crime and victimization. They're exactly the same. And so when we go into those communities and help those kids make better choices, give them better opportunity, give them hope, when we make sure that they're treated fairly, and they know they're going to be treated fairly in our justice system, all of those things can make a difference. And, you talk about breaking the cycle of retaliation. It was always front of mind. Whenever there was a shooting in Toronto when I was the police chief, I looked at who likely was responsible for the shooting, but I also looked at the friends of the victim, because it was just as likely they were going to go out looking for somebody to retaliate. And so we intervene in that. We'd go and talk to them and stop that from happening. So we wouldn't get the second and third shooting from the first. And all of those things are really important. And if I may, and you'll forgive me for this, but I did run the Toronto Police Service for a long time. I got a huge amount of help from then Premier Dalton McGuinty. And Paul, you'll remember, of course, David Miller. And they helped us put a lot of additional police officers on the street. And if you use them right, not to lock everybody up, but to keep everybody safe, cops count, and they can make a difference. And there are several hundred fewer police officers today because those programs ended. But for a long time, the City of Toronto and the province of Ontario made big investments to help us keep the city safe. And the deal that I made with them is I wouldn't just use those police officers to make more arrests, because that's not what's important. What's important is making our neighborhood safer, helping kids make better choices, helping kids be successful in school and not end up in trouble and suspended or whatever. Schools should be absolutely safe places. And so, and I apologize, I could go on for a long, long time about this. I want to promise you, we are taking some steps to bring in greater gun control. But that's about keeping guns out of dangerous situations and out of the hands of people that would hurt others with them. And there are some really important and effective things we can do. But if that's all we do, we're not doing enough. We have to invest in our communities. We have to invest in our kids. And that public health approach you speak of is exactly the right way to think about it.
Thank you.
Thanks, Mitzi, and thanks, Bill, for that fulsome answer. You'll be interested to know, Bill, that according to the numbers here, you're actually more popular on this show than Mayor Tory. So the next time we see Mayor Tory, we'll have to mention to him that your numbers are way better than his.
Can I tell you, John? John's a very competitive man, and
Yeah.
if you tell him that, he'll come back on your show until he beats my numbers.
I know. So I think Paul and
now,
Mitzi.
Minister, right now the mayor's got a way to go if he wants to beat your numbers.
John, Paul, I used to have a TV show on CP24 called The Chief, and then when I left, it became The Mayor, and John started doing it. I think his numbers were probably better than mine. And by the way, whenever John McKay says that, thank you for my fulsome answer, that's subliminal. He's telling me I talk too long.
It's taken me 2 years to get that subliminal answer across. See, I'm going to take the advantage of the prerogative of the chair here and make an outright steal of Paul's next question, because it's one of the questions I've been thinking about.
That's the federal government stealing from the municipality again.
I feel so badly for you.
Send me a check, John, and I'll forgive you.
That's all you ask us for is checks. It's pretty blindingly obvious that there is misinformation and disinformation perpetrated by state and non-state actors, and where it was kind of an academic preserve of people who are interested in security, in the last 3 or 4 weeks, we have been exposed to the full force of misinformation and disinformation campaigns. And from Russian TV, you can see the Canadian public being fed about misinformation about vaccines, about mandates, about anything that you and I would regard as fundamental. You can see from the funding of the blockade, a lot of the money came from foreign sources, and you can see that the level of political discourse, which is foundational to our democracy, is really deteriorated. And we are all in that ecosystem. All of us are practicing politicians. I am very concerned, as I assume you are, Bill, that if you will, the foundational understandings of political discourse have deteriorated dramatically to the point that we are in significant danger of having serious hits on our democratic values. And I was wondering whether you've given some thought to that. I'm pretty sure you have. In not only in light of what's happened in the last 3 or 4 weeks, but in light of even today's war with Vladimir Putin, where we just know there's going to be a massive disinformation campaign launched through Russian TV and others. So I'd be interested in your reflections on that issue.
John, I think it is an important issue, and you asked if we've reflected on it. I spent 2 hours actually with the Prime Minister on this very issue today. Just speaking about sort of the lead up to the invasion of Ukraine, we knew for weeks that they were lying, and that they were spreading very deliberate and calculated lies over a period of time, and some of that is all licensed within Canada. There's Russian television that was very much involved in that, but it's not just the foreign entities as well. Even, for example, with the blockades that we were receiving, a substantial portion of the money that was being used to fund that activity was coming from the United States. And it's not necessarily the hostile activity of a state actor. It's not the government of the United States that's trying to undermine our society or our democratic institutions. But there are people in Canada, but there's a lot of people outside of Canada who, for a number of different reasons, are intent on destabilizing and challenging our democratic institutions. Canada stands, I think, as one of the well-recognized, democratic countries and free and democratic countries in the world, and that's frankly a bit of a threat to some people. And so they are making an effort to undermine us. But John, rather than just, as we could all sit here and collectively criticize that disinformation and misinformation and what is, I think, sometimes a very nefarious intent behind it, they're just not playing with us. They're trying to create instability in the country. But I think we also have to think about how we can, as a country and as a people, be more resilient to that. And I think part of what we're dealing with in this country right now is we've been through 2 years of deprivation with COVID. People are tired, and they they want very much for life to return to normal. We talked a little bit about normalcy. I think we all do, and I think that I would like to think that would make us hopeful and a better people. But we also know those deprivations and the frustration and anger that sometimes accompany it can bring out the worst in us. And I think that's being exploited. I think it's being exploited by hostile state actors, but it's also being exploited by people who are, filled with ideologically motivated extremism and radicalization. And I think we have to be thoughtful about how we make ourselves stronger and more resilient to those types of attack, because the attacks are going to take place. At the same time, I also, as you're aware, John, we're looking federally at better regulation of some of those media platform that, under normal circumstances, I think we had. I remember 40 years ago dealing with, very hateful groups like Ernst Zundel standing on a street corner handing out, printed pamphlets. The internet, the various media that's available there has made that an extremely challenging thing to deal with. It's not. We had the tools to deal with the guy on the street corner with his pamphlet, but this is on steroids, and hate and misinformation is coming at Canadians from every source. And I think it's something we really have to think about, how we do a better job. On the one hand, we try we're absolutely committed to freedom of expression and we value the free press, and we want to retain that. That's part of who we are as a people. And at the same time, I think we've got to be mindful that there are people taking advantage of the gaps in order to bring harm to this country. And I was for a long time responsible also for the national security intelligence agencies. We've begun to look very carefully at ideologically motivated violent extremist groups and organizations and the hostile activities of state actors, Russia being one of them, with absolute certainty, the country and people within that country are intent of harming Western interest and Canadian interests. And we've just got to do a better job of protecting ourselves.
I very much agree with you, and I am, however, a little discouraged that whatever thinking is going on is not going on quickly enough. And I'm reminded of that great Winston Churchill phrase that a lie is around the world 10 times before truth has its pants on. What that might have been true. That was true 80, 90 years ago, and it's true on steroids.
John, I would point out that Canada was the first country to start listing those, white supremacist, racist, hateful groups, listing them as terrorist entities. And I think I will tell you, the entire Western world is paying a great deal of attention to that. Yeah. And that was my portfolio, my responsibility to bring those listings forward. But, we've also turned the attention of the national security intelligence establishment towards what I think is the greatest threat to our domestic security. And it's those hateful organizations who are intent, and some of them are foreign funded, that they're global in nature, but they're clearly intent on attacking our values and what we would regard as our freedoms. Like these people that are shouting at us from Wellington Street, John, the word freedom. I would hope they would understand, what real freedoms are in this country, and and the limits of freedom that are also our responsibility to make sure we respect the freedom of others.
I recommend to all of our listeners today an article by former Chief Justice Beverly McLaughlin on the balance of freedoms. It was quite excellent and a thoughtful article. So Paul is not going to ever speak to me again because I've stolen way too much time, which I think for some people might think is a benefit. But
Two checks.
Paul, yeah, 2 checks, yes. Paul, you're on.
Thanks, John. Minister, I have a question from Wayne. He would like to know, why is it that we cannot increase the penalties per possession of handguns? I'm sure that a mandatory 5-year prison sentence with no possibility of parole, for example, would be a big deterrent for simple possession.
Yeah, and Wayne, it's a good question and something I thought about for many years. There's something very attractive about what we call mandatory minimum penalties. Because and it really is a bit of a reflection that we don't trust our courts and we don't trust our judges to give the penalties for crimes that we think are appropriate. And I will tell you, if if Wayne had asked me that question 15 years ago, I probably would have said, yeah, Wayne, you're right. Let's have a really serious mandatory minimum penalty for simple possession of a firearm. And then I thought a little bit, and I've had some experience with this, where you get into a situation where possession doesn't require, and I apologize, I'm going to get a little technical here, but possession doesn't require anybody's intent to hurt somebody. And so there have been circumstances, I've seen them, I've witnessed them from firsthand, I've been involved in investigations where this has happened, where a young person might have, be in a car where there's a gun. They might have, and what possession requires is knowledge, consent, and control. So they may be aware it's there, they may have consented to being there, but they had without any intention to hurt somebody. It doesn't mean that it's not an offense, or that the court and the judge shouldn't take into account and consider all of the circumstances of that kid and the crime and apply a sentence that's proportional to the offense. That's a very different thing than somebody puts a gun in their pocket and goes out into a crowded, neighborhood and starts, waving it around or discharging it with an intent to hurt somebody. That's a very different level of crime, and you shouldn't have the same penalty, the same mandatory minimum penalty for two very different types of offenses. And so one of the things I would just say to Wayne is, I think we have to be very clear to our courts of our expectation of how seriously we view these offenses. And we do that by applying, appropriate maximum penalties. And if the judge gets it wrong and gives the wrong penalty, we've got a system of appeal and to appeal it to a more competent court to get it right. But at the same time, I worry a little bit about those occasions when we get it wrong. And the justice system should be just for everyone. And part of that is allowing the courts and the judges to listen to all the evidence and to consider, like, the maximum penalty is always for the worst offense and the worst offender. The judge gets to figure that out. That's the important job we've given them. And I'm frankly less inclined today to take away that judgment of that our courts apply and to impose something that maybe doesn't fit the circumstance.
Before I turn it over to Mitzi for the last question in this section, I'm just going to ask Napas if there's questions that have been texted to you. If you could send them to my cell phone, and I can and put them to our guest. So Mitzi.
So I'm going to combine one of my questions with another one, and it really is around the moment we are in. John had talked about, Winston Churchill's moment, and, there's been many moments. So we are in a particular one right now. And, whether it's, people using semi-trucks and, locking their air brakes in place and settling into a city for 3 weeks, or it's the misinformation that is permeating everywhere. What do you believe we have learned, and how do we become better prepared for these activities? Which it seems to me that we have to expect it. We have to expect that these things can happen. Washington is now, going to get a dose of it. So what is it that we've learned to help us be better prepared next time?
Mindy, as you were asking the question, I thought when I retired as the police chief, 39 years there, 10 years in the chair, somebody asked me, like, what was the worst day like? And I thought about it and I said, it was great because that was the day we had to be at our best. And in very difficult and challenging times, I think that's the thing that calls upon us as political leaders, as politicians, but as citizens. This is the time we need to be at our best. And yeah, these are difficult times, and it's been challenging. But we're going to come out of this pandemic. We have the opportunity to get a start over on so many things, and I think we need to take full advantage of that opportunity. Like I apologize if I'm sounding a little bit too optimistic here, but we have to be hopeful. Like, this is a great country, and people have come from all over the world to make this their home, and they speak every language, know every culture and every tradition. It's an extraordinary place, and so we've got a responsibility, I think, to each other to pick ourselves up and dust ourselves off and get over some of the deprivations and challenges that we have faced. It's not like it's over, but we're a great country. We're a strong country, and Canadians are great people, I think. All of us, no matter where we've come from, we're great people. And so I remain optimistic. And like, difficult days are the days we have to be at our best. And so, yeah, these are tough days. And so let's go be at our best. And I think we'll be able to look back on it, and our kids will look back on it and say, yeah, that's like, they really came through here. And because we have the opportunity and the obligation to come through here.
Let's all come through. That's what we hope for. Yeah.
No, that's a very thoughtful answer, Bill. I wanted to get and we've got a few minutes left here, I see. And I don't see any questions coming in from Napas, but I wanted to get to other elements of your portfolio, more specifically, how we will continue to interact with provinces and other levels of government on what are inevitably climate change driven catastrophes and disasters. So in 2022, we handle them in a particular way. How will we be handling them in 2025, and how will we be handling them in 2030? And what will be different?
A number of important things, John. First of all, we've learned a lot from our experiences over the past few years. One of the things, that just has a small example, that after the floods in BC, I established and co-chair a table that's made up of ministers of both the provincial government and the federal government. We meet on a biweekly basis, where the transport ministers are together and talking about how we're going to fix the highways. When the ministers responsible for Indigenous Services Canada are talking about how we're going to help those communities. Indigenous leadership, like all three of the national Indigenous organizations, are at the table and helping us with that. That to me is a really good model because one of the things we recognize, and by the way, and this is for Paul, I spoke to the president of FCM the other day and said, we've got to get municipal voices at that table, because I don't talk about the three levels of government, it's the three orders of government. And I come from a municipality, and I know how important that level of government is. And they do most of the first response, and they're the ones that are there right to the end in the rebuild. And so we've got to bring them in as well. But I think that level of, like, what I'm trying to do is bring people together, because I think we've got all the good parts. It's just a matter of making sure that those parts fit together and that we don't allow for gaps to happen. We're also trying to be very much more forward thinking in our response to emergency, John. And this is this whole notion of preparation. Preparation and planning. When the pandemic hit, I was very kind of at the center of our response, and we went looking for the planning documents. Some of them came from SARS, some of them came from H1N1. They were all out of date, and so you got to keep that planning evergreen. You got to practice, you got to exercise, you got to work together with all three orders of government, and just do a better job of figuring out how to do this, and with civil society as well. Like one of the things in the pandemic is I reached out and entered into an agreement with the Canadian Red Cross. They created a humanitarian workforce, which was absolutely critical in our recovery in long-term care facilities in Ontario and Quebec, in communities right across Canada. And so engaging properly with Canadians through various civil society organizations is something else that we are doing as well. And we're just making sure that we're also. you froze, John. I think I'm good. We're trying to make sure that it's expensive. Emergencies are expensive. We're trying to make sure that we invest in prevention and mitigation as much as we do in recovery.
So the questions I've been getting in have been some measure answered, but let me take Douglas's question, unless Mitzi or Paul are burning to ask one, and talk about communication infrastructure failures, and ask you to reflect on our cyber preparedness. We've seen a hospital shut down. We've seen banking systems shut down. Now Douglas asks, is amateur radio considered a backup during full communication infrastructure failure? Maybe there's an answer to that. I don't really know, but the cyber vulnerabilities in our country, I think, are enormous. And I know you've done some thinking about this. I'd be interested again in your reflections on where you think we are at with cyber and where you think we need to go.
John, as a society and as a country, we've become incredibly reliant on digital systems. And we have seen, for example, ransomware now is considered by many in law enforcement to be a bigger organized crime activity than the illicit drug trade. It's massive. And we've also seen ransomware attacks in the city of Toronto, in the private sector, on healthcare systems, which it's the theft of data, sometimes the corruption of data, and the denial of service that we can't afford to have our healthcare systems go down, for example, or the transit system to be impacted the way it can be on these cyber attacks. And so we have in the government of Canada a really good response to, and I've sent them in, like the fire department. One of our provinces, for example, had all of their health care data was hacked and held for ransom, and so the Canadian Security Communication Security Intelligence unit it's part of the Canadian Armed Forces. We sent them in there to help them sort of recover from that attack. But there's an investment here, John, that needs to be made. We've done it a lot in the federal government. Within sort of the world of the federal government, we've got good, strong sensors in place, and lots of, we're attacked, by the way, several thousand times a day. But our defenses are strong, and not impenetrable, by the way. So we've always got to work at it, and sometimes we get hit too. But the provinces and municipalities in the private sector, the banks are pretty strong because, as you can imagine, they're well funded for it. Some of our utilities, like the nuclear industry, are also really strong. But there are vulnerabilities, particularly in the healthcare sector, that concern me, and within municipalities. It's all, from my perspective, critical infrastructure. And one of my responsibilities as the Minister for Emergency Preparedness is to protect the critical infrastructure of the country. And that includes things like utilities and transportation and manufacturing and government, healthcare services, et cetera. And so we know that, we're working hard to make sure bridges don't get washed away, but it's just as problematic as when the communication systems that run those systems are attacked. And we saw, by the way, I'll just point it out, the first attack in Ukraine wasn't the firing of a vessel. It was a cyber attack on critical systems within Ukraine that took down, their communication systems, a lot of their military installations, hobbled their airports. That's where the first attack came from. And so there's a lot of work to make sure that we are secure, protected, resilient, and able to recover when those things happen.
Yeah, no, this is an enormous area that I don't know that we've explored very well. Paul, Mitzi, do you have any last questions? There's a few questions that have come in from the audience, but have you got anything you want?
I think it's been covered, certainly from my perspective.
If we have time, John, if you want to do another question from the audience.
Well, let me ask this final one, which is a bit political. Countries like the US, UK, and France are lifting their restrictions, even though Canada is doing better in terms of COVID. Why is that?
Well, we are starting to lift some of our restrictions. I would point out that most of the restrictions that people have experienced on with vaccine passports in their stores and limitations on restaurants and bars and in the workplace. Those have been a result of mostly provincial health authorities. Some municipalities have imposed them. Most of the federal limitations are different than other countries. Most of the federal limitations have been on international travel, but all of the measures that we've put in, well, some of them like mask wearing and everything else is just to slow down the spread of the disease. Some of the travel restrictions that we have imposed, we've begun to lift those. A lot of I think, from our perspective, the thing that's going to help us most get out of this pandemic is the vaccination. And God bless the people of Scarborough who all lined up, and the Scarborough Health Network, by the way, has been outstanding in this, and as has the City of Toronto. Well done, in getting people vaccinated. And I think we should all be grateful to each other as neighbors. It's a pretty good sign that we look out for each other in Scarborough, and we went out and got our vaccinations. But I think as well, we're also reaching the point now where we've got a very high vaccination rate in this country. We know that there's a proportion of the population, a cohort of the population that just chooses not to. We want to the extent possible to encourage them to do that. But I think that you will see a careful but a certain lifting of restrictions over the coming weeks and months. We've already done it on some of our restrictions on testing and things like that at our border, lifting travel advisories. People just, like all of us, I don't know any Canadian who doesn't want to get back to normal. We're tired of the restrictions and the deprivations of the pandemic. But we need to make sure that we do it safely. And so we're trying to strike that balance, but we are most certainly going to come out of this thing. And we all look forward to the opportunity to think this has been good over Zoom, but it'll be nice when we can all be in a room together.
Yeah, amen, brother. Before I call on Paul and Mitzi for their closing thoughts, I just wanted to say on that question, if you compare our death rate with the American rate, the Americans have suffered in excess of 900,000 deaths. We have, I think, about 36,000, and we are about 10% of their population. So on the American rate, we should have had 90,000 people who are dead. I think it's a testimony to the responsibility of citizens in this country and in this community, and particularly even in Scarborough Guildwood, which has an 85% full vaccination rate. That our deaths and hospitalizations are dramatically lower than any one of these countries that are mentioned in the question, and that to my mind is a testimony to some good governance, but also some high level cooperation in the Canadian citizens. So, with that, Paul and Mitzi, closing remarks.
Ladies first.
Okay. Well, I think on that note, I want to remind people to get their vaccinations or their boosters if they have not done so. Everyone 5 years old and up is eligible to be safely vaccinated. And I do know that there are areas in our community in Scarborough that could take advantage of some of the work being done by Toronto Public Health and Scarborough Health Network to make it more convenient. I want to say a huge thank you to who I call Chief Blair, because that's just how I've always known you. It's been wonderful spending the last hour with you. Your passion and your drive for public safety is unmatched. So thank you so much. And I hope that you are successful in setting up this new ministry, because I know that we need it for the security of our future. So have a wonderful evening, everyone, until we meet again in our virtual teletown halls.
Paul?
All right. Thank you, everybody. Minister Blair, in particular, thank you very much for joining us this evening. I know you've had a tremendously busy couple of months, both domestically and internationally, and I can't thank you enough for joining us this evening, for your insights and your comments and your advice and your perspective on your ministry. To my colleagues, John McKay, Mitzi Hunter, as always, it's another great town hall. Tremendous number of residents out. I enjoy working together with both of you, keeping Scarborough Guildwood a strong, vibrant community. To all of the residents that joined us this evening, thank you very much. Thank you for sending in your questions and your comments. And last but not least, I cannot say enough to all of the residents. Please get your first, second, your third pediatric shots for children. If you don't have them, don't be shy. Nobody's going to shame you or embarrass you if you're going in for your first one, but please get them. I can tell you, I sit on the Board of Health of the City of Toronto, and we see the stats on a regular basis, and 75% of the people in our ICUs are those people that have not been vaccinated. So the vaccinations are working. Please get vaccinated, protect your family, your friends, and your neighbors. Stay safe, everyone. Thank you.
Thanks, Paul. Bill, a final thought or two?
I think I've spent all my thoughts, John, but listen, this was a real pleasure. And frankly, like I said, I've known the three of you for a long time. Always appreciated your hard work for the community, and the opportunity to speak to my old neighbors in Scarborough Guildwood is a real pleasure for me as well. So thanks very much for the opportunity to do this. If in the future John comes back, Tory comes back and beats my numbers, then call me and give me another shot at it.
Yeah, well, that's an open and standing invitation.
Deal.
Yeah, we'll get Tory in, and we'll see whether we can get something going here. Mind you, Isaac Bogosh was a pretty popular guest as well, and I'm not sure who we'll have as our next guest next month. But thank you, Bill, for your thoughtfulness and your reflections on really some very difficult issues. It's clear that the Prime Minister has a lot of respect for your experience, but also your ability to judge an issue. And I think we, as the people of Scarborough and the people of Ontario and the people of Canada, are thankful for your willingness to extend your life of public service from that of a police chief to Minister of the Crown. So thank you, and thank you for joining us tonight. So that's it, folks. I see the questions are pouring in here now. I don't know what I'm going to do now. We're going to have to dream up answers, or I'm going to have to sit with Bill in question period, and we'll write out answers while he deals with question period.
Maybe a reminder, John, to people if they want to email them in if they haven't to one of our respective offices, and we can get them answered.
Okay, good thought. Okay, thanks everybody. Thanks, Bill, and we'll see you next month, hopefully. Take care.
Thanks a lot. Good night, all.
Good night, everyone.
Take care.